Okay, so you know how we always ask you guys to send in stuff you find interesting online? Well, this one comes straight from one of our awesome listeners.
Nice.
Who sent in this YouTube transcript from a channel called Kirk Patty Cake.
Interesting.
And the video's title really jumped out at me. It's called Representation is a Scam.
Oh, wow. Okay, so right away we know we're in for
kind of a provocative...
a strong opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So basically what we're going to do in this deep dive is really dig into the arguments this YouTuber is.
Okay, sounds good.
His name is Ian Kirk Pattycake, and he, I love this thing. He describes himself as an author, idiot, and loin streamer.
Okay, so he's definitely
right?
got a sense of humor about himself.
Totally. And he's very upfront about, not taking himself too seriously, which I kind of appreciate.
Yeah, I like that.
He even says right in the video, like, look, I'm not saying I'm the smartest guy in the room, but I think this is something worth talking about.
Yeah, and he wants
I really
to encourage other people
respect that. Yeah.
To talk about it too.
Totally. He's like, even if you disagree with me, like, tell me why, tell me what you think.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, so that's kind of the spirit we're bringing to this deep dive as well.
Absolutely.
But let's get into, like, the heart of what he's arguing.
Okay, so what's the...
He's basically saying that this whole idea, this big emphasis on representation in creative writing...
Like, books, movies?
Yeah, all of this, all the stories we consume.
Okay.
He's saying it's basically a scam.
He's going all in.
He is, and he lays out like these 7 points to support that argument. So that's what we're going to go through.
Cool, let's do it.
Okay, so his first point, and it's a big one, is you are not the characters and the story.
Okay, I think I kind of get where he's going with that.
It's like this assumption that as a reader, you should be able to see yourself perfectly reflected in every character you encounter.
Like a mirror image.
Yeah, and he brings up this example that I thought was really interesting.
Okay, what's that?
There was this Muslim woman author, and she had a Muslim sensitivity reader.
Oh, interesting.
And the sensitivity reader actually felt like the book didn't represent her experience.
Wow. So even within a group that's supposedly being represented,
it's not a monolith.
There are differences of opinion.
Exactly. And it brings up this question of like whose experience gets to be the dominant one, even within like a broader identity category.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It makes me think about, we talk a lot about wanting to see ourselves in stories.
Yeah.
But is it always about like seeing a perfect reflection?
Right.
Or is it also about opening ourselves up to experiences that are different from our own?
Yeah, and I think that's part of what he's getting at. Like maybe it's not always about finding yourself in a character, but finding like empathy or common ground, even if their life looks totally different from yours.
That makes a lot of sense.
And then he also brings up this other example that I thought was really interesting.
Okay, what's that?
So there was this author who wrote a book called The Blood Between Us, and it's about the Chinese slave trade.
Okay.
And she's actually descended from people who were involved in that trade.
Okay.
So she's writing about her own family history.
Interesting.
But she got accused of cultural appropriation.
Wow.
Yeah, which is...
That seems really tricky.
No, it's like, where do you draw the lines, right?
Who gets to tell which stories?
Exactly. And this YouTuber, he kind of frames it as like an ego thing.
Okay.
To demand that a character represent you perfectly.
Like it's all about you as the reader.
Yeah, and I think he's pushing back against that.
Okay.
He's saying, like, maybe we should be looking for something a little bit different in the stories we consume.
More about expanding our horizons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then he has this other point that I thought was really funny, but also kind of profound.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He says, like, we don't need fictional characters to give us permission to do things in our own lives.
Like that.
Right. He calls it patronizing.
Like we need
this fictional character to show us that it's okay to do something.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And he uses all these examples like, women at NASA doing incredible things in science. They didn't need to read a novel first to know that they could do that. Or people who choose not to go to college.
Or, people who decide not to get married.
Yeah. Or people who decide to become a chef.
Right.
Like,
all these different life paths.
Yeah.
Are valid.
And those possibilities exist regardless of whether or not you see them represented in fiction.
I think that's such a good point.
Right.
Because sometimes it can feel like if we don't see it represented somewhere,
then it's not possible.
Then it's not possible or it's not okay.
Yeah. And he's really pushing back against that.
I love that.
So that was his first big point. Like, you're not the characters. You're not the story.
Okay. Great point number 1.
And then his second point kind of builds on that. He says, you are not the author.
Oh, okay. So now we're
thinking about the creator. And he's basically saying that, like, when readers demand that an author should write their specific life experiences into a story, it's like they're asking that author to write for them.
To basically become their mouthpiece.
Yeah, exactly. And he acknowledges that sometimes that does happen.
Right. Sometimes you're hired.
Like commissions or...
Just specific.
Yeah, if you're writing for like a specific, company or something. But his point is that most of the time, authors are writing from their own heart.
Their own ideas.
Yeah, their own experiences, their own characters, their own perspectives.
And they're sharing that.
Yeah, they're putting something of themselves out there.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily trying to be everything to everyone.
Right. Like it's not their job to reflect every single reader's experience.
And I think that's important to remember because sometimes it can feel like, if you don't see your specific experience reflected in a book, it's like that author has done something wrong.
But they've ignored you.
Yeah. And he's kind of challenging that assumption.
I like this idea because it kind of speaks to the whole idea of, authorial intent and artistic freedom.
Yeah.
Versus, the expectations of the audience.
And he actually has this suggestion that I've heard a lot in writing circles.
What's that?
He's like, if you have these specific stories or experiences that you're burning to see, try writing them yourself.
Oh, I love that.
Right?
Take control of the narrative.
Yeah, instead of demanding that someone else represent you.
Yeah, make it happen.
Go make it happen.
I love that.
So that's point number 2.
Awesome. Point number 2 down.
Okay, so his third point is no individual represents a group of people or all experience.
Okay, so this feels particularly relevant to a lot of conversations.
I know, right?
I've been seeing online.
This is like the heart of it.
Yeah.
He's really skeptical of this idea that any single character can truly represent every single experience within like a broad identity.
Like can one character speak for all women?
Exactly.
All men.
Or all Christians or all Muslims or, any big group of people.
Yeah.
And he brings up these examples that I thought were interesting.
Okay, what are those?
So he talks about these books that have been praised for their representation.
Okay.
Like The Power or The Men.
Oh, yeah, those were big.
Which are both very female-centric stories.
Yeah.
But his point is like, not every woman felt seen by those stories.
Right, because women are not a monolith.
Exactly.
And to say that one book
you can't capture
just speaks for all women is
often nuanced.
Kind of an absurd idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he also talks about this feeling that sometimes fiction can feel like it comes from a place of privilege.
Okay, interesting.
Like it lacks a certain rawness or emotional depth.
Like it's been sanitized a bit.
Yeah. And he contrasts that with writing that comes from like different socioeconomic backgrounds.
Okay, so
he mentions Freddie Prinze Jr.
Interesting.
Who has written about kind of like rich yuppie culture.
Okay.
Versus his own characters like Joey Alex and Anna, who are often like working class.
Yeah, and dealing with different kinds of struggles.
Okay.
And he's very clear that these characters are meant to be individuals first and foremost.
Like they represent themselves.
Yeah.
Not a whole group.
They're not standing in for an entire demographic.
Yeah. That makes sense.
He uses Joey as an example. He's like,
yeah.
She's this young woman from a trailer park. She's dealt with abuse.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean she represents every young woman who's ever been in that situation.
Right.
And I think that's really important.
It is.
Because it gets to this idea of like the weight of representation.
Yeah.
Can you put that on one fictional person?
That's a huge burden to carry.
It is.
Any character.
Yeah. And he's saying like, it's almost impossible for one person to represent all the experiences of any large group.
And I think it can also be harmful.
Yeah, how so?
Because if you hold up one character as like the representative of a group, and then someone from that group doesn't see their own experience reflected in that character,
they might feel invalidated. Exactly. It's like, okay, so I guess I don't count.
Right.
Because I'm not like that character.
And that's the opposite.
That's the opposite of what we're trying to do.
Of what we're going for.
With representation.
Totally.
Yeah.
So that's his third big point.
Okay.
And this one I think is really interesting for people who are interested in like the craft.
Okay, let's hear it.
Point number 4 is it homogenizes.
Okay, so that sounds like it's about...
Yeah, he's talking about the impact that this kind of pressure for representation can have on the stories themselves.
So like what we see on screen.
Exactly, like what actually gets written.
Okay.
And he's saying that when there are these really strong demands for specific kinds of representation.
Like you have to show this group in this way.
Yeah, it can lead to more predictable narratives.
Oh, okay, interesting.
And limitations on what characters can do or how they can be portrayed.
Because you don't want to offend anyone.
Yeah, and you don't want to fall into stereotypes.
Right.
But he makes this interesting point about stereotype. He calls them recognizable patterns.
Okay.
And he even jokes about being a stereotype himself.
It's like we all fit certain stereotypes to some degree.
Yeah. And his point is like, if we're so afraid of stereotypes that we avoid anything that's even remotely off the beaten path,
Then every story.
then all the stories start to look the same.
Still the fam there, yeah.
And he's arguing that art should be a space for like diverse perspectives, even uncomfortable ones.
So don't shy away.
Yeah, don't shy away from the messiness.
And the hard stuff.
And he actually mentions that he wants to discuss this in more detail in another video.
Okay, cool.
So maybe we'll check that out for a future deep dive. But he also touches on this idea that, fictional characters, they're often flawed.
Just like real people.
Yeah, they make mistakes, they have moral failings.
Yeah.
And he's saying, like, if we expect them to be perfect all the time,
To be these.
then it's not really
Paragons of virtue.
It's not really storytelling anymore.
It's just PR.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point.
It is, because if we're only allowed to show the good side of any group,
Right.
then we're not really telling the truth about human experience.
Exactly.
Which is messy and complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we tie this back to representation,
Okay.
he's basically arguing that when representation becomes solely about positive portrayals and avoiding any potential offense,
It becomes a marketing campaign.
it can turn into like PR for an entire group.
Yeah.
And that's not really what storytelling should be about.
Right. It loses its teeth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so his fifth point is really interesting because it kind of shifts the focus onto us as the audience.
Oh, okay. So this is about how we consume stories.
Exactly. He says, stop going to fiction for validation.
Oh, that's a bold statement.
It is, right? And he's asking this really fundamental question.
Like, why are we doing that?
Yeah, like, why are we going to fiction to get our identities and our life choices affirmed?
Like, are we looking for permission from fictional characters?
Yeah, or are we looking for a sense of belonging, or like we're not alone?
That makes sense.
And he shares a little bit about his own approach. He's
Okay.
like, I haven't really looked to external sources for validation.
Okay.
And he talks about his relationship with his father, which I think informed that perspective.
Makes sense.
And then he kind of broadens it out, and he's like, look, people go to social media to get validation.
Oh, yeah.
He
Yeah.
uses this example of like poets wanting to be recognized as writers.
Oh, yeah.
And, needing that external affirmation.
Right. To feel like
Yeah, to feel legitimate.
I'm a real writer.
Yeah. And his point is like, what happens if that external validation away?
Yeah. Then you're left with nothing.
Right. Then you're left feeling empty and like you've lost your sense of self.
Because you've built your whole identity
On this external.
on what other people think.
Yeah. And I think his message here is really about cultivating internal validation.
Like believing in yourself.
Yeah.
And your choices.
And having confidence in your own path, even if you don't see it reflected perfectly in a book or a movie.
I really like that.
Yeah, I do too.
Because it puts the power back in your own hands.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's not saying that fiction can't be a source of comfort or inspiration.
Right.
He's just saying it shouldn't be the only thing you rely on to feel good about it.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting to distinguish between like healthy reality checking
Yeah.
and like constant validation seeking.
Yeah, there's a difference.
Because sometimes, it's good to get feedback.
To see how your work is landing.
Yeah, to see if you're on the right track.
But if you're constantly looking for someone else to tell you that you're good enough,
Yeah, that's a different issue.
that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so point number 6 brings the author back into the equation.
Okay.
He says, understand when you get into a book, you're seeing the world and characters that somebody else created.
Okay, so remember, the author is
Yeah.
a person, too,
Yeah, and they have their own experiences, their own biases, their own perspective.
that they're bringing to the story.
And he's saying, like, it's fine if you don't connect with certain aspects of a book.
You don't have to love everything you read.
Yeah, or even if you find it unsettling or challenging.
Yeah.
But he's saying that demanding that authors rewrite their stories according to your vision.
Like, according to your specific worldview.
Yeah, he calls that asinine.
Okay, so he's not a fan of that.
Not a fan. And I think this gets back to that idea of like authorial intent and artistic freedom
Yeah.
versus trying to control someone else's creative expression.
And he also talks about this idea that I've seen come up a lot
What's that?
about hiring people with authentic experiences
Yeah.
to make sure that representation is accurate.
Mm-hmm.
But then he brings up a really interesting point.
What is it?
What happens when there are conflicting accounts of a particular experience?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Like whose experience gets to be the definitive one?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's often overlooked.
Right, because there's this assumption that there's like one true experience.
Right, like there's one way to be a woman or one way to be black or one way to...
And he's really challenging that.
Yeah, he's saying it's more complicated than that.
Way more complicated.
And I think he also gives a really relatable example.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
He talks about, a reader questioning a detail in a book.
Right, like based on their own limited...
Yeah, based on their own limited experience.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I've never seen that, so it can't be true.
Right, and he's basically saying like, look, everyone's perspective is skewed.
We're all seeing the world.
Including his own...
Through our own filters.
Yeah, and he's very upfront about that.
Yeah.
He's like, look, I'm sharing my perspective, but that doesn't mean it's the only one.
Right.
And I think that's really important to acknowledge.
It is.
Because it gets to this idea of like humility and recognizing that we all have blind spots.
Yeah.
And we can all learn from each other.
Exactly.
If we're open to it.
Yeah.
So that's point number 6. And his final point, I think, is one that will resonate with a lot of people because it deals with this issue of offense.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot topic.
Yeah, he says, generally, a character is not an insult to a group unless the author is deliberate in creating a character for them.
Okay, so he's talking about authorial intent again.
Exactly. And he's saying that just because a character from a particular demographic behaves badly
or is unlikable
doesn't automatically mean that the author intended to insult that entire group.
Right, like you can have a jerk.
Unless it's really clear
who happens to be a woman.
That was their malicious intent.
And that doesn't mean all women are jerks.
Exactly. And he uses this example. He says, like, if an author creates a selfish white male character, does that mean they're trying to insult all white males?
Right.
And I think that's a really good question.
It is, because it forces us to think about, like, what is the author actually trying to say?
Yeah, what is the point of this character?
Right.
And he gives this counterexample from the book, When No One Is Watching, where white yuppies are portrayed in a very negative way. So it's an example of how representation can be used to critique a specific group.
Right.
But he's cautioning against assuming that the intent is always to offend or to be destructive.
Look, sometimes it's just exploration.
Yeah, he's like, approach each story as an individual creation.
With its own unique message.
Yeah, and he brings up these examples that I think a lot of people will relate to.
What are those?
He talks about the complaints about fat Disney villains.
Oh, yeah, I heard that.
And like evil ginger characters.
Right.
And he's suggesting that sometimes we can get so sensitive to stereotypes.
That any portrayal.
Almost any portrayal feels offensive.
Feels like an attack.
And that can really limit the possibilities of storytelling.
Yeah. Because then you're walking on eggshells all the time.
Totally.
Afraid to do anything that might upset someone.
And he's arguing that we should try to assess stories on their own merit.
Like separate from...
Yeah, separate from all the external feedback
the bag.
And expectations and noise.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Because otherwise we get caught up in these like meta-narratives.
Right, and we lose sight of the story itself.
And what the author is actually trying to say.
And he ties this back to the danger of limiting thought and discussion.
Okay, how so?
He draws this parallel to 1984.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Where the party controls language.
Right.
To control thought.
To control thought.
And he's saying that, like, if we're so afraid of offending anyone, that we start policing language and policing expression.
You end up in a very restrictive place.
Yeah. And he actually mentions that one of his goals with his channel was to provide a space for dissenting opinions.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because he felt like there was this pressure to conform.
Like you can't say certain things.
Yeah, and he was pushing back against that.
I respect that.
Yeah, and he ends this point by encouraging writers to be bold.
To tell the stories they want to tell.
Yeah, even if those stories have flawed characters or...
Even if they make people uncomfortable.
Yeah, to not be afraid of judgment or backlash.
I think that's a great message.
Yeah, it's inspiring.
To end on.
So that was his 7th and final point.
Okay. So we've gone through all 7.
We did it.
What a journey.
I know, right?
So basically this YouTuber, Kirk Pattycake, is saying that this whole intense focus on representation can be really limiting.
And problematic.
Yeah, for both the creators and the audience.
Exactly. And his main points, as we've discussed, revolve around this idea that, the reader is not the character.
And the reader is not the author.
And that one character can't represent an entire group.
Yeah.
And that demands for specific representation can lead to less diverse storytelling. And that we should focus on finding our own internal validation.
Rather than looking to fiction for that.
Yeah. And that storytelling is subjective.
Right. Everyone has their own perspective.
And that we should consider authorial intent.
Before assuming that a portrayal is meant to be offensive.
Exactly. So this leaves us with a really interesting question for you, Drew.
Hit us with it.
How does this perspective on representation challenge or affirm your own
When you're reading a book or watching a movie.
Yeah. Or engaging with any kind of media.
Does it change how you think about representation?
And does it maybe even change how you might approach creating your own story?
If you're a writer or an artist or any kind of creator.
Yeah, those are some big questions.
They are, but I think they're worth wrestling.
Totally. And just to be thorough, he does wrap up his video with a few more thoughts.
Okay.
And some kind of tangential references to Waylon Cross and Josephine.
Oh, interesting.
Which weren't really central to his main argument.
Okay.
But it just gives you a sense of like his personality and his interest.
I like that.
Yeah. So that's it for this deep dive into representation.
Awesome.
And as always, we encourage you to keep thinking critically.
About the stories we consume.
About the stories we consume and the intentions behind them.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so
that was a lot.
A lot to unpack.
I know, right?
But I think it was really worth it.
Yeah, I mean, this whole issue of representation.
It's so complex.
It is, and it's something that we're all grappling with.
Yeah.
As creators and as consumers.
And I think this YouTuber's perspective really challenges us.
To think about it in new ways.
To question our assumptions.
Yeah.
And to maybe even be a little more open-minded.
I love that.
Yeah, me too.
So what are your final thoughts?
I think one thing that really stood out to me was his emphasis on internal validation.
Yeah, that was huge.
Because I think it's so easy to get caught up
in looking for external validation.
Yeah, in needing other people to tell us who we are.
Or that we're doing the right thing.
Yeah. And I think his message of like finding that validation within yourself
is so powerful.
It is, because it frees you from needing anyone else's approval.
Yeah, you're not beholden to somebody.
You get to define yourself. Yeah, and that's really liberating.
It is.
Yeah.
So I think that's something I'm going to take away from this.
Yeah, me too.
And I hope our listeners will too.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there,
keep those transcripts coming.
Keep sending us the stuff that makes you think.
Because we love to unpack it with you.
Exactly. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Sounds good.
Bye.